Welcome to Bluecoat Talks, a conversation between a Bluecoat and a guest expert. I'm Olathe, and I'll be your host for today. And our guest is Dr. Raymond Francis, who is a science operations engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. And he is working on the Mars 2020 Perseverance Rover, which is landing this Thursday. Welcome, Raymond.
Hello.
For those of you who are joining us live, please type your questions into the comments for Raymond and we'll weave them into the conversation. So just to get started, Raymond, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up working for NASA for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory?
Yeah, so I've been here at JPL for about 6 years now. I started here as a postdoctoral fellow working actually on the other rover mission, the Curiosity rover. And that came from doing a doctorate at the University of Western Ontario in a mix of robotics and planetary science, getting computers to understand images of rocks and sort of artificial intelligence for planetary geology. So I started there, and that led me into teaching robots on other planets to do the same thing.
Wow, very cool. So what exactly is your role in the Mars 2020 mission?
So for the last few years, I've been working in preparing the mission and how we're going to operate it and training the science team in how they could use the new rover to explore a new place on Mars. But now that the rover is just about to land, I'm moving into what we call the surface operations phase. And so I'll be part of the science operations team. So I'll have a role in either planning out the activities that we're going to do and helping the team come to a decision about where to drive and which observations to take, which instruments to use on which rocks and where to go, or sometimes just operating one of the science instruments.
Wow. So Perseverance launched last July. What has it been like waiting all this time for it to land and then, for it to be so close, for it to be Thursday?
Yeah, so, there's anticipation, but we've also had a lot of work to do. The mission was not ready for operations on the day of launch. It was ready to launch, but there's a lot still to do before landing. And so we've spent the last several months doing the final training of personnel, the final testing of new software tools that we've developed to operate the rover, practicing all our procedures, both the nominal procedures, we say, if things go well, and the anomalous procedures if things don't go well. Yeah. So every few weeks for the last 9 or 10 months, we've been having these operational readiness tests and things.
Wow. So yeah, new stuff to consider. And so, Perseverance looks a lot like Curiosity, but how is it different? How is this mission different than previous missions?
Yeah, you're right. At first glance, the Perseverance rover looks a lot like Curiosity. And in fact, the design is based on that of the Curiosity rover. We had a very successful rover design, so why completely redesign it? Mm-hmm. But we have different science goals, and so we have different science instruments, and we have different equipment on board. I actually have a little diagram here that I can show.
Oh, great. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. And so this is just to show some of the key differences, in addition to the science instruments, many of which are sort of upgraded versions of the ones on Curiosity, but some of which are completely new. We had to respond to that with some structural design changes to the rover. The increased weight of this rover meant that we had to add some structure here. This little crossbeam is something that helps you recognize if you're looking at a picture of the old rover or the new one, because Curiosity doesn't have this. Another kind of obvious difference is up at the front, this kind of round structure here. This is the new sample caching system. Curiosity could take rock samples with its drill, and it would reduce those rocks to a powder and then place that powder into its instruments on board. But the Perseverance rover is actually meant to take samples that will be preserved and sealed up in tubes to be returned to Earth later.
Wow, and this is the very first, sample return from Mars, right? Yeah, okay.
That's right. Yeah, we've never attempted Mars sample return, and this is meant to be the first step in that. And in order to do that, we had to invent this new complicated set of mechanisms. And if you know anything about spacecraft, mechanisms are one of the hardest things to do in space reliably. We have a very, very complicated sample handling system here. And this includes a drill out here on the robotic arm. That's one of the so-called heavier science tools here. Mm-hmm. But it also includes a lot of machinery inside the rover, so much that it actually doesn't quite fit in the rover body. And so you see it sticking out in the front here. That's another way to recognize the Perseverance rover from Curiosity.
Okay.
And the other hint is that the wheels are different. We have a different tread design here. Instead of the old zigzag system, we have these very gentle curves, and the wheels are a little narrower. It's something we learned from Curiosity. That wheel design on the 2012 landing, it worked well until we got into a place with really pointy rocks that were stuck in the ground, and we learned, okay, that design needs some tweaking. So the new rover has improved wheels.
So you kept what worked, and then you modified where there was room for improvement. And this is big, right? It's like the size of a kind of an SUV. Is that right?
Yeah, this is the size, maybe a little bit smaller than a large SUV, but on the smaller SUVs or a large car, yeah, this thing weighs over a metric ton.
Wow.
Over 1,000 kilograms. And when it's deployed like this, the mast here, you know, I'm like a fairly tall guy, and my eyes are right about at the same height as the cameras here on the bottom of the mast. So the mast itself is even taller than me.
Okay, well, we've got a couple questions here. So one from RC James. Perseverance launched on the Atlas V. We just talked about how it's really big, but could it have theoretically launched on a cheaper but maybe more powerful rocket like the Falcon Heavy? I know this isn't your niche, but do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's possible. So, you know, I think it remains to be seen whether Falcon Heavy will in the long term be cheaper to operate. There are reasons to think it might, but, you know, we'll see. But even if it is cheaper, one thing about spacecraft is that they are designed, the spacecraft are really sensitive. You know, we have a lot of sensitive electronics and complicated machinery, and the ride to orbit is not gentle. No matter which rocket you pick, there's a lot of vibration, a lot of bouncing and shaking, and in fact, each launch vehicle has its own vibration profile. So some of them have a lot of energy at lower frequencies, and some of them have a lot of energy at higher frequencies. And so you actually, when you're doing the mechanical design of a spacecraft like this, especially a very complex spacecraft, you actually have a set of reference launch vehicles that you are designing for, so that
you have to know what vehicle is launching your spacecraft, like before you even start designing it.
Yeah. And often at the early design phase, you say, okay, this thing we're designing will be about this big, and so there's these 5 launch vehicles or options, and you know, we know that NASA won't let us launch on that one, so it's going to be these 4. And you say, okay, we'll constrain it to that. But often when you have a large payload like this rover, over a metric ton, and going to another planet, you need a big vehicle. So the options are really limited. So you might limit it to 1 or 2 at the start. You only have 1 or 2 options. And you say, oh, you know what? It's really hard to meet the launch vibration spectrum imposed by that one at this high frequency because we have this thing, just as a general example.
Yeah.
And so you say, you know what? No, we really have to go with this launch vehicle. So once you've already built you've designed the vehicle, you start building it, and then you will do some testing to make sure it can meet that vibration profile. If you suddenly had to switch launch vehicles, you have to go back and redo the analysis and redo the testing to make sure it can fly safely on that launch vehicle. So I don't know if it could fly on Falcon Heavy, because Falcon Heavy didn't exist when we were designing this vehicle, so we didn't know the vibration profile.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so you pointed out the camera, which is at sort of your eye level, and we do have a question about how the rover is taking selfies, because apparently on the internet, people are using Curiosity selfies as like proof that the Mars missions are fake. It's funny, I've heard about people thinking the moon landings are fake, but I hadn't heard that for Mars. So how does the rover take a selfie?
So they take a selfie the same way I do, which is they put a camera in at the end of their arm and then take a picture, right? And the rovers, and yeah, you get the image up, I think. So out here on the robotic arm, there are some cameras, and one of them in particular, the Curiosity rover has a camera called MALI. It's the Mars Hand Lens Imager. And an almost exact copy of that same camera is now included on the new rover, on Perseverance. Here, because it's part of the Sherlock instrument, it's been included in this spectrometer. And they're calling it Watson because it's the partner to Sherlock. But anyway, the MALI camera design, or the Watson camera, it's a wide field camera So it takes pictures that are like kind of like the ones that your phone takes in terms of the field of view. And also like your phone, it can focus on things that are very close and also things that are very far. And so when we use it, it's out on the robotic arm to take pictures of rocks from really close up, because the mast, it's up at like my eye level. And so there's only, you can only see so well things that are down on the ground. So we put the robotic arm down over the ground, and you can take like from a couple centimeters away these images with Molly or Watson. But you can just turn the turret on the end of the arm with the instruments. You can just turn it around, and you can put it right out in front of the rover, and then you point it all around, and you can take a collage of like 50 or so images, and then you've got the rover and all the area around it. If you want to make it look good, you actually have to. This is some clever robotics. They actually move the arm so that every image is pointing at a different part of the rover, like it covers the whole scene, but also every image has the camera focal point in the same position, just oriented in a different direction. So very, very precise robotics to be able to make a mosaic like that. Anyway, if you look, you can find when we do one of these, we put all the images public, and nowadays we often do two things. First, all the images from the camera, and at the same time, we take images from the mast with the nav cams, and you will see all these pictures. If you ever look through the pictures and you see lots and lots of pictures of the arm back to back, it's us taking a picture from the mast of the arm taking the selfie picture. So it's the arm going through this crazy set of poses to take the selfie. So anyway, it's real. You can do it. And
to find those pictures, would if you just kind of Google like NASA Perseverance.
They don't exist yet from Perseverance because that rover hasn't landed. But for the Curiosity rover, you just like go type Curiosity rover raw images, and there's a whole website, and it's sorted by which day it was and which camera.
You'll see the arm, and very cool. Very cool. All right, there we go. So you mentioned that this is a planned sample return mission. Of course, we've never done this before, so it's kind of we're going to see. But what are we looking for with those samples? Like, what samples are we bringing back, and why are we bringing them back?
Yeah, so we want to understand the history of Mars, right? And in particular, we want to understand one of the key questions is whether life ever existed on this planet. It's not the only thing we want to know. We also just want to understand the history of the planet, because these two planets, the one we live on and the one next door, Mars, formed from the same materials at the same time, next to each other in the solar system, and they've turned out very differently, right? The Earth is very habitable and warm and full of life, and has active plate tectonics. Mars is cold and seemingly dead now. But we know a couple of things about Mars. We know that it used to be warmer and wetter. We can see that from features like you see on the left side of the screen here. These are what we call large-scale fluvial features. They were formed by flowing water. And these exist all over Mars. And we also know, since the Curiosity rover mission, we know that at least some of those warm, wet places on Mars were habitable. They were the kind of places where if there were bacteria and microbes could have thrived. So we know the place was habitable. So now the next question is, were any of these places inhabited? And that's much, much harder to answer, which is part of the reason that this is a sample return project, because you want all the laboratories of the Earth to be able to put all of the best equipment, and equipment we haven't even invented yet, because by the time these samples come back, new techniques will have been developed. So we want to be able to do that with all the equipment we have here on Earth. And to answer that question, they've picked this place called Jezero crater. Jezero actually coming from, there's several Eastern European Slavic languages where Jezero, or a very similar word, means lake. And as it turns out, Jezero crater is an ancient lake, maybe the most ancient lake on Mars. It's something like 3.5 billion years old. It's in a crater that filled with water and then was full of water for so long that there was a river flowing into it that had time to build this delta. I called it a fluvial feature, but in particular, it's a delta. This is a river delta like the one in the Mississippi or the Nile that takes a long time to build out of flowing sediment.
Okay. So there was time for life to to the
Yeah,
delta.
yeah. So this was there long enough to build a delta. So maybe there's time for life to form. And if you have a delta and a lake, those are both lake bed sediments and lake shore sediments, and also deltas are both really good places to preserve any extant life. When I say extant, I mean extant 3 billion years ago. But if you go look in the sediments of lakes around Northern Ontario, for example, there's a lot of lakes, and any of the lake bed sediments will show the history of life there, because the sediments are continually being deposited, and microbes and other organisms get trapped in the sediment, or their bodies fall to the bottom of the lake. And deltas are constantly putting down new layers of sediment. And then this sediment has, had 3 billion years to get solidified into rock. So we imagine either in the delta or in the lake bed or in the what we call the marginal deposits around the rim of the crater here, around the edge of the lake, these would be good places to preserve any life that had been there. And even if there isn't any, if we never find evidence of life here, we will still understand, let's say, a negative result from perhaps the oldest lake on Mars would also be an important thing to say, okay, lakes like this on Earth were forming habitable environments that were inhabited on Earth at that time. If they weren't on Mars, that tells us that there was something different about these two planets, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And also, the history of the planet from 3.5 billion years ago will be revealed in these rocks. So even without the life, this is a very exciting geology and history of the solar system mission.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, there's implications to finding life. If we do or don't find life on Mars, that sort of has implications for whether or not there's, a lot of other life in the universe, right? Like if this habitable planet doesn't have it, it does bring up interesting questions going forward.
Yeah.
And I definitely have lots of more questions. And those of you who are joining us live, please go ahead and send us your questions as well. Get in on the conversation. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, so you gave a lot of good reasons for choosing Jezero Crater. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me, what was the process like? What were the conversations around the table when you were trying to decide where to land this, very important mission?
Yeah, and we're putting all our eggs in the Jezero basket, right? We have one big, expensive mission that we're sending here, and then Mars sample return, which is meant to follow after this. We'll send another mission, maybe 2, to go collect and then return to Earth the samples that this rover takes. So we've really put a lot of investment and a lot of our eggs are in this basket, let's say. In any case, yeah, why Jezero, and how do you choose Jezero? Yeah. So I gave some good excuses why this is a nice landing site, but the landing site selection process took years. The entire world Mars community was invited to this, and they had a series of what they call site selection workshops every couple of years. And we started out with, at the first workshop, everybody's favorite place on Mars got proposed, and people mm-hmm. would come and present, and they say, look, this is here are things we should know about Mars, and here's why my site could help us answer that. And eventually it was whittled down to 16 sites. And then, people started focusing on those, doing detailed studies. People actually went and requested orbital data from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter or the European orbiters that exist, so that they could study some of those candidate sites in more detail and then argue for their selection. Then we were down to 8, then we were down to 3. And finally, the arguments were, do we go to this ancient lake, which is a familiar kind of thing from Earth, where, we would be confident if there was a lake like this on Earth, it would be full of microbes. Or do we go to other different kinds of environments? And the final 3 landing sites were this lake with the delta. There was another site in Northeast Syrtis Major, which was focused on this kind of hydrothermal alteration of rocks in between 2 geological events that could be well timed, so we could constrain very well a time when, if we found any signs of life there, when that life had been. And the third one was a kind of exotic suspected hydrothermal spring system that actually the Spirit rover from almost 20 years ago had previously visited. In the end, Jezero won. But I think there were good reasons to think that those sites might also have been reasonable places to explore. And, Mars is still there to explore. There may yet be missions that go there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, from that map, it looks like maybe a bit of a tricky place to land. I definitely want to get into the landing. But I do want to take a question from our audience before we head into the landing, which is exactly like what kinds of evidence of life are we looking for in Jezero? So like what is evidence of life?
Yeah, so I think that is, of course, an open question. Like, how do you recognize life? How do you recognize life from another planet? Would it look like Earth life? And also, if it's been preserved there for 3.5 billion years, what's left? So one thing to be sure, if this is 3.5 billion year old life, and if it's going to be, these planets formed at about the same time, Earth and Mars, life on Earth took almost 1 billion years to get going. And when it did at 3.5, maybe a little more billion years ago, you're talking microbial life. By this time, by 3.5 billion years ago, microbial life was starting to organize itself into like structures. Sometimes you could get these mats and these features we call stromatolites, which are sort of these larger structures that they form bulbs or other kinds of shapes. Yeah, and they can grow to be meter scale things, which is helpful if you're looking for things that you can see. And so we kind of imagine that the most likely form for any life to have been here is microbial, and anything larger is going to be things that microbes built. So if there are stromatolites here, that will be an amazing discovery. If there are not, we're going to have to be looking for signs that are much smaller than that. And so if there are other microstructures that they build, or then you're looking for the bacteria or the microbes themselves, or sometimes the bodies of microbes are not preserved for billions of years, but the changes in chemistry that they created and left behind are. And so organic carbon, organic materials that are preserved in rock in certain ways. So sometimes you look for isotope ratios. Sometimes life preferentially uses one type of carbon instead of another, or there are other elements where you can see isotope ratio displacements like that. But those are the kinds of things we would have to find after we bring the samples to Earth and put them in laboratory equipment where we can measure precisely fine differences in chemical composition or isotopic composition. So that's why it's hard to find life, because we're not going to see dinosaur bones. That's a wild idea. Stromatolites maybe, microbial, preserved tiny microbes perhaps, if we get lucky and drill in the right place. Chemical imbalances that are indicative of life, maybe.
Actually, in doing some reading, I came across that some of these samples might be coming to a Canadian laboratory. Dr. Chris Hurd might be getting to do some analysis. So that's kind of cool that a Canadian might get to look at some of these samples.
Yeah, we have a whole team of people on the project who are specifically added to the mission to be experts in what we call returned sample science, which is something we don't usually do with Mars rovers. We think about in situ measurements. So now we have people who are telling us how to explore and how to take samples such that they're best for the science that would be done after the samples are returned. And Chris Hurd in Alberta is one of those people.
It's very cool. So on that note too, I know I want to get to the landing. We're going to get to the landing.
Sure.
But I know you have a cool video that you showed me just of the laboratory environment, like where they're getting the rover ready, and it's very clean. And could you maybe talk about that and why it's important that the rover's clean, that the samples, all the equipment that takes samples is very clean?
Yeah. And I don't know if you want to bring that up, but we have, can you see that?
Not yet. Oh, there it is. Yes.
There we go. Yeah. So this is a view of the clean room at JPL in Pasadena. And you see all the little badges in the background. These are all the missions that were built there. There's a lot of planetary missions here. And this is a view, it's a video, I'll play it in a moment, but this is a view of the rover, the real rover, in the clean room, and they're putting the robotic arm through some of its tests. And you see that these people are all dressed up in clothing, special clothing that covers their whole bodies, basically everything but their eyes. And this is so that they don't drop a hair or a little flake of skin or any kind of biological contamination, partly because you could damage sensitive electronics or sensitive equipment with that, but also because we have a sample handling system here. And the last thing we want to do is take a sample of some rock on Jezero crater and include in it some bacterium that fell off of Jim from the clean room, and then package that up with the sample, send it back to Earth, and then study and say, oh yes, there's bacteria, and it looks just like the kinds of bacteria that you get when people forget to wash their hands before they go to the clean room. Yeah. So you see they're all covered up, and you see these little wires, these little cables here are designed to prevent static shocks to the rover. So these people who are handling the rover are they're grounded to the support equipment.
There, yeah, I can see that.
So that
both ways. Like, are we also being careful not to contaminate Earth with potential Mars? Like, I mean, we don't expect anything to be alive, but in case there's something, are we also sort of protecting things both ways?
Yeah. We have the concept of planetary protection. We call forward planetary protection, and also coming in the other direction, where we want to protect the samples from us so that we don't contaminate them, and so that we can actually measure what's actually from Mars. But if there's anything alive or anything noxious of any kind on Mars, we don't want to contaminate the Earth either. And they did this with the lunar samples and even the astronauts back in the 60s and 70s. When they first landed, they would go into isolation for a little while until they were convinced that the moon was good and dead and there was nothing there. But we're not sure about that with Mars yet. And so, yeah, we're going to be very careful. They are going to build, this is now in the works. And actually the Canadian Space Agency is involved in the planning for this. Cool. Is how will we design this kind of curation facility for these Mars samples, and what procedures and such would be in place?
That would be a cool place to work.
Yeah.
I have an audience question. So Perseverance itself is not returning, but when will we get those samples back potentially, and when might we first have some results from this mission? And could that happen before the samples come back, that we get some results? Yeah, for sure. So your first result, the very first result, a picture from the ground, may be back as soon as a minute after landing. Because one of the very first things we do is take images with the rovers. We have these engineering cameras that are for choosing safe driving paths, and soon after landing we'll just take a snapshot. And you may, if you watched the Curiosity landing some years ago, that was the first picture we got back, was the HazCam image that just showed the ground in front of the rover and showed, oh yes, we're right side up on the ground. That's good news. And then it's going to take us a couple of months to really unpack all the systems on the rover, test the robotic arm, put the mast with the cameras up, do all these things, try out all the science instruments, calibrate all the science instruments. That's going to take some weeks, even a couple months. And then we're going to really start going. But we will immediately, I mean, we're on Mars, and time on Mars is valuable. So as soon as we have those things ready, we're going to start studying our environment, understanding where to go, and we're going to be getting data back on a daily basis. Science results, properly published, will take a little longer because people are very careful about drawing conclusions and then going through the peer review process. But you'll be getting pictures daily, perhaps as soon as minutes after landing. And then the samples. So to get the samples, we have to send the current architecture for sample return, and this is subject to revision as we go through the detailed design. But the current idea is that the Perseverance rover collects the samples, seals them up in hermetically sealed tubes, leaves them on the surface of Mars in a carefully selected spot or more than one place. Then another mission goes,
sends a little rover whose job is to be fast and to pick up samples. It goes, picks up the samples and brings them back to its lander, which also carries a rocket, a launch vehicle, to launch the samples in a special container into orbit. Then a third mission, which is an orbiter only, would go and grab the orbiting sample canister and drag it back to Earth. That's sort of where we're at. So that's going to take a little while. The sample fetch rover would launch no earlier than 2026, and I think maybe we're already talking 2028. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it'll take a couple of years to get everything there and back. So we're looking at early 2030s is my guess when we might get samples back. But then we'll probably spend, several decades studying them. So we're not in a super rush.
That's cool. Okay, so we've got another sort of technical instrument question. How deep will Perseverance be drilling below the surface of Mars, and just how long does it take for it to do a core sample?
Mm-hmm. So the drill goes down only a few centimeters. So you're looking at like that. So you're going to be looking at rocks that are very, very close to the surface. Which is one of the reasons, again, that Jezero is promising, because that delta is eroding back. And so it's exposing things that have been buried for a long time, preserved for a long time. So we have access to newly exposed things. But yeah, very, very shallow, a few centimeters depth. And to take a drill core is there's sort of two ways to answer this. One is that the actual drilling takes a couple of hours scale. It depends on how hard the rock is and other things. It takes so much power, takes so much energy that it's basically the only thing that happens in a day on Mars. So it's sort of that way you can say it takes a whole day. But also we're not drilling randomly. We're not just driving around, drill that, drill that, drill that. Each one of these samples is going to be the result of a dedicated geological survey campaign that will take weeks as we try to understand an environment, understand what is the structure and meaning of this environment, and then what, given that, is the best place to sample. So you could say that each sample takes weeks. So, yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, let's get into the landing part of it. For those of you who do want to watch this live, we're going to put a link in the chat so you can watch the live stream. So for our time zone, Eastern Standard Time, it's going to be at 3:00, Thursday, the 18th, very soon this week. So you can check that out. And what we won't be able to, you mentioned that there are cameras around that are going to be able to capture the landing. We're not going to get those images right away, like we might get that first ground shot, but we do have some pretty cool animations of what that landing is going to look like. And I'm also curious to hear more about the sort of the AI aspect, like the decisions that can be made.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I have an animation here, and as Aletha said, if this all goes well, we're going to get some very high resolution video and sound from multiple perspectives, but we won't get that live. That'll be sent back over the very slow interplanetary bandwidth afterwards. But this is nonetheless what it's going to look like. It's similar to what you saw with the Curiosity rover, the same basic technique, but we've added a lot of improved software intelligence and autonomy to this. So what we're seeing here is just, okay, here's empty space. Here comes the capsule, the cruise stage here that's containing the spacecraft. And it'll flip in a moment to the perspective looking down towards Mars as we see the beginning of the EDL sequence. There's the solar panels, the whole cruise stage. We don't need that anymore. That just got us to Mars. Now what we have is a capsule with a heat shield, and you see little rocket jets on the back that are doing fine steering just to make sure the trajectory is well followed. This thing heats up. It looks like a meteor going through the atmosphere. If you were on the ground, this is what you would see streaking across the sky. Most of the speed and the energy is dissipated by the heat shield. It's slowing down from tens of thousands of kilometers an hour. Like launch, this is a rough time, maybe as many as 12G acceleration. Autonomous steering here at about Mach 2, the parachute goes out. That's the largest supersonic parachute we've ever made. But the parachute can only slow us down so much. And so eventually we have to rely on other techniques. This heat shield now is no longer useful. It's just an obstacle and an extra weight. So we're going to drop it off. And then we're going to release from the back shell and fall like this for just long enough to get away. And then we use rockets to descend. And these rockets will slow us down more than the parachute could. But if you take those rockets all the way to the ground, they will blow rocks and debris around and potentially damage the rover. So we have to separate the rockets from the rover. And during this descent, we have to find a nice safe place, by the way, to put down. And I'll talk afterwards about how we did that. But here looks like a safe place. So we're going to begin throttling down the engines and then winching the rover down on cables like this. As soon as the rover feels that it's on the ground with all 6 wheels, cut the cables, and then this descent stage has done its job. We don't need it anymore. What we need is for it to get lost. And it flies off as far as it can. And then we're left with a rover on the surface. This is the plan. And it worked for Curiosity. Let's hope it works for us. But one thing that's different is we're able to land in places like this. So Jezero here, you can see we got a nice flat plain, but not far away you have huge cliffs. That is not safe to land on. And Jezero is a place that would not have been safe for Curiosity. It's safe for Perseverance because we have new smarts, new intelligent software that's included as part of the landing system. And what we have is we have 2 things. First, we have what's called range trigger, which allows what it is it's a software that allows the rover to deploy its parachute based on altitude, like how far it is from the ground, which is more precise than just relying on a clock. You hit the top of the atmosphere and you start counting, and you say, okay, go parachute. That was the old way.
Yeah.
Now we have range trigger. We will be able to sense altitude and be able to fire the parachute at that point, which narrows the uncertainty of where we're going to come down. But then the other thing we have is called terrain relative navigation. And maybe I'll like bring us back to this point here. So once we're free and falling here, we have a view now that the heat shield is gone of the ground. And there's in fact both a radar and a camera on board the descent stage and a map of the ground at Jezero Crater. So it can compare what it sees to the map and say, oh, this is where I am. And it also knows that several parts of that map are unsafe and several parts are safe. And so if it's coming down on the unsafe part, it computes where it's going to come down. And if that place is unsafe, it picks a nearby safe place and steers toward it in real time.
Wow.
So that allows us to land at a place like Jezero, where parts of the landing area are not safe. These cliffs are no good, but this flat plain is. And the rover knows that, and it knows where it's falling. That's something we did not have terrain relative navigation with Curiosity. So we had to land on a large open flat plain with few hazards. But now our landing zone can have holes in it. It can have hazards in it. So that is a major improvement, and that's why we're able to go to Jezero Crater and land near things like this, near cliffs like that. And of course, the cliffs and the places where rocks are sticking out of the ground, that's what's interesting to the scientists. So terrain relative navigation is a game changer for like putting a science package near a cool place.
That's very cool. And are we using software like that to actually help too, like we're on the ground for navigating?
Yeah, so we have, there's a range of autonomous systems, but probably the 2 most exciting things that we have on the new rover. First of all, Curiosity had some ability for autonomous driving, and we were able to make productive use of that. But the auto nav on Perseverance is greatly improved. We may be able to send it hundreds of meters in a single drive cycle, which is not something we would regularly do with the old mission. And so it's faster, it's smarter. The old auto nav on Curiosity, the way it works is it drives, it takes some pictures, computes a stereo model of the environment and says, okay, I see that rock is an obstacle. I will avoid it and I'll drive around it. It had to stop every time it took those pictures to like do the computations and then, okay, move it forward like a meter or 2 and then stop and take pictures. So it's very slow. Mm-hmm. But now we'll actually be able to drive continuously, slowly, but continuously while taking those pictures. So that's one of the big things. And we also have some clever AI for the science instruments as well. So,
but it still requires, human involvement, even though it's nice to have this some automation because there's a delay, right, between you sending a command and it doing something and you getting the information back. So it's great, but you are still there working on it. And I know when we were setting up this talk, we actually had to do it today. We couldn't do it any sooner because you were switching to Mars time. That's pretty cool.
That's right. Yeah.
So what does your day look like? Like, what are you doing while Perseverance is on Mars? It's a full Martian year, right? Which is 687 days. Is that?
Yeah, roughly. Sort of the prime mission is planned to be sort of 650 odd days. It's very likely that, based on past rover experience, we may well go years beyond that.
Yeah.
And yeah, the schedule is strange. The rover, especially early in the mission, once we're on the surface and we have this rover, we want to get it commissioned and unpacked and tested and make sure everything's working and get it like into a healthy routine quickly. And the most efficient way to do that is to work the rover all day. And day means when the sun is up. But on Mars, that's a different thing than here on Earth, because Mars has a different rotation period. It's similar. It's actually just a little more than 24 hours, about 38 minutes more than 24 hours. But what that means is that if you want to do things when the sun is up at Jezero crater, you have to live on a Mars schedule. We call it Mars time. And that means that you're not living on Pacific time or Eastern time on Earth. You're living on this Mars time schedule. And you're getting up for work about 38 minutes later each day. But of course, it's not just when the sun is up, it's when can you communicate with the rover, when can the rover send data to us with the relay orbiters. So it's actually something like 24 hours plus 38 minutes plus or minus 2 hours. And so each day you kind of have to look at, okay, well, what time does work start tomorrow? Let me check the schedule. Okay. Let me backdate how long it takes to have cereal in the morning and get to work, and how long I like to sleep, and say, okay, that's bedtime. And you have to sort of do that each day. But eventually it sort of walks through the day, on average about 40 minutes a day, And so it's a bit like sort of having an hour or two of jet lag every couple of days. But
and
that's,
it's a whole international, it's people from all over the world, all different kinds of time zones kind of having to get on Mars time. But then, of course, we've got the global pandemic, and that must be changing things. Like you worked on Curiosity too, and how is this going to be different because of that? Like already people were coming in remotely, but is it different?
Yeah. Well, so Mars time on the previous missions, it's hard enough to do, but we only do it for the first couple of months of the mission because it's really difficult to live on Mars time forever, especially if the grocery store still closes on Eastern time or whatever.
Yeah.
But, everyone on the science team and the people who are operating the rover, all those people would come together and we'd be at JPL and be working at 2:27 in the morning or whatever but we'd be doing it together in a big room with the windows blacked out, so we wouldn't know what the sun was doing here on Earth. We were just focusing on Mars. And it's easier to do that when you have the team doing it all together.
Mm-hmm.
This time, because of the coronavirus problem, our international partners, we have contributed instruments and people participating from a number of countries in Europe and across the United States and in Canada. And those people are not traveling to come here. We're doing this all remotely this time. And even the personnel who would normally be in mission control at JPL, the numbers of people in the control rooms have been reduced as much as possible. Anyone who can do their job from remote, from home, even if they live in Pasadena, is doing it remotely. And so people have to stay at home, and they might be on Mars time while their families are on some local time zone on Earth. Everybody kind of gets the same problem though, because Mars time cycles through the Earth time. So sometimes it's almost exactly aligned with Pacific time, and sometimes it's aligned with Eastern time, and sometimes it's aligned with Central European time. So there's some point of the month it's convenient for everybody, but most of the month it's a hassle for everybody else.
Working on Mars.
What can you do? Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've got another audience question. That the pandemic one, that was something our audience was curious about too, how that affected the mission. in terms of photos and samples, what area do you expect to cover? Like not in the, if it goes for years and years, like as has happened, but just in the one Mars year that you definitely have planned out. What's your sort of coverage?
Okay. So we have a notional traverse, which is to say a route we might drive depending on where we land, which has been built up. Actually, I can even show that if I.
Also, hi, Julie. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, let me just back up here to the other slide. Yeah, so if I take us here. So this is a view of Jezero crater, and the this sort of blue ellipse is the landing zone. And that's where we have like a 99% probability of coming down, somewhere in there. And this line, so from the center of the ellipse, which is maybe the most likely place, we could land anywhere in that ellipse. But if we land near the center of the ellipse, and hopefully TRN, the Terrain Relative Navigation, will do that for us, then we may well drive something like this route, which is meant to take us to the delta, the crater floor, the units at the margin here, the lake edge sediments, and then out of the crater for potential dotted line future exploration after the first year. So you're looking at several kilometers of driving there if things go according to this plan. And it's quite reasonable to drive several kilometers in the space of the first Mars year. So that's one idea of scale. Samples, we're looking at, this is a pencil, and this is about the size of a sample core. It's only a few centimeters long, and it's, on the order of a centimeter or less in diameter. That's about the size of a Perseverance Rover rock sample. So they're little tiny things. When you take a sample like that, you're going to take very high resolution images of the area around the sample, and then pretty high resolution images of a larger area. And then you're also going to document with, moderate resolution images the whole environment where the rover was. And you're going to do that with photographs, but also with all the different spectrometers we have. So we'll document that very well. And the rover is not going to cover hundreds of square kilometers with images because we're on the ground and it's very difficult to cover very large areas. That's why we have orbiters. But yeah, that's something like how the sampling would go.
Wow, that's this is just all extremely exciting, and we definitely appreciate you taking the time out of. I know it must be a very busy schedule getting prepared to actually be kind of remotely working on Mars. I think we're getting, to the end of our time right now. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us. And if anyone does have any super quick last questions, we can bring them in. We do have actually one question pop up. I think this one might be, there's maybe a misunderstanding here. But so the question is, if Earth is in a lower but slower orbit than Mars, and Mars has a higher but faster orbit, why is a Mars year longer than an Earth year? But I think there's a misunderstanding because as we get sort of further down the gravity well created by the sun, we are going in, the planets are having to orbit faster, right? So Mars is in a larger orbit.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's not a faster orbit. It's just larger.
Yeah, that's right. And this is true for satellites of the Earth. Like low Earth orbiting satellites go at about 7.5 kilometers a second, and very high satellites will orbit slower. And the same goes for planets about the sun. Yeah. The circular velocity, as we call it, about the sun of the Earth is faster than that of Mars.
So that answers the question. That's why the Mars year is longer, because it's in a larger orbit and it is going more slowly, and it just ends up being about 2 Earth years. Yeah,
and that's why some of the other planets have years that are much, much longer than a single Earth year, decades.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, this is hard to close, but I'm going to go ahead and just say thank you so much. It was really awesome talking with you, and thank you to everyone who joined us live. And one more question.
Sure. Yeah, I've got a couple minutes.
Yeah, you're okay. All right. So this is from Dan Smith, and he's wondering what your academic background is, and how that how you prepared for this job.
Yeah. So the short answer is I went to school a lot. The long answer is that I have an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering. And then I did a master's degree in physics, which was focused on space science, like space mission design and the design of satellite constellations and things. And then I went and did a doctorate, which was sort of jointly in electrical and computer engineering and planetary science. I had doctoral supervisors in both of those domains. And the thesis for that doctorate was about applying artificial intelligence and computer vision techniques to geology and atmospheric science on other planets. Basically, getting computers to automatically process images of natural scenes without human help on other planets. And that, sounds very relevant to this kind of work. So yeah, I did that kind of thing. And I spent a lot of time, especially during the doctorate, working with planetary science people while building my skills in computer engineering.
Very cool. Yeah, and to those of you watching, like there are a lot of different kinds of jobs you can do in the space sector. And if you're interested in working in this sector, I really encourage you to find mentors, to reach out and pursue it. Because I mean, it's a cool career.
Yeah, and the team I work on is full of there are some computer scientists and computer engineers, but I have a lot of geochemists, atmospheric scientists, mechanical engineers, and electrical engineers, and scientists of every description. One of my colleagues did a degree in music before moving into planetary science, and another was a dance instructor before she became a rover operator. So
oh, wow.
There are a lot of paths.
Well, and we've got the people, creating those, beautiful rendered images of what the landing might look like. So there's art and, computer programming.
Yeah, I'm never going to make these artist conceptions of satellites and rovers. I can't make those.
And then there's a legal team, right? Like there's yeah. So if it's something you're interested in, definitely pursue it. Okay. So thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here, and hope you have a great rest of the day and good luck on Mars.
Yeah, thank you. Man, my pleasure.